feels like more than wine. I'm sorry.
Are we off, Gary? Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome. And a welcome also to our Zoom audience. I've just got to say an admin thing to the Zoom audience, which is that at the end of this, we'll have question and answer. And for you to do a question and answer, click the bottom of your screen and you'll see a Q&A symbol. If you click that, then up will come a form and you can type in a question. And we'll get the questions and we can puzzle our speaker with these questions afterwards. It's a great pleasure to welcome Chris Herbert to us. We've had about 8 or 9 festivals, I've slightly lost track, but he's been a speaker at every one. And he's so good that I keep wanting him to come back. And usually he finds something different to talk about. It's we first met Chris when he was Archdeacon of Dorking, about 25 years ago or thereabouts, maybe 30 years ago. And then he received promotion to become Bishop of St Albans. But we've managed to stay friends ever since, in spite, well,
It's been a struggle.
We're greatly looking forward to your talk. So very much welcome to Haslemere.
Thank you very much.
Hamish, thank you very, very much indeed. It's lovely to be back here, it really is, and see so many friends, including people I know from Farnham, so I'm not going to look in any particular direction. But anyway, it's lovely to see everybody. I'm going to be talking about the King James's Bible, and I just better check technologically, is everything okay, Gary?
Everything's working.
Wonderful. So apparently I mustn't move more than about 2 inches either way, otherwise I'm in trouble, not least with Gary and Hamish. So I'm going to talk about the origins of the King James Bible, but to put it into context, I want to talk very briefly about various versions of the Bible that have existed for a very, very, very long time. If you want to find the oldest fragment of a gospel from the New Testament, and it is only a fragment, it's about the size of a business card, you'll need to go to Manchester, to the John Rylands Library. And there you will see this particular fragment. There's a question mark about its date. It's a tiny fragment of the Gospel of John. And it was found by a man called Grenfell, who was an Egyptologist, in a pile of other stuff that he was going through. And he realized its importance. Question of date. How do you date a papyrus? The answer is you have to do it by looking at the particular style of handwriting, paleography. So there is some dispute about the date of this tiny, tiny, tiny fragment, somewhere between 125 and 175 or thereabouts. So that's John's Gospel. The oldest fragment of Mark's Gospel, and these are only fragments, is dated somewhere between 150 and 250. It's part of a codex. I'll say a little bit about the codex form. As you will no doubt know, in synagogues, rolls were the technology used to, when you came up to read a passage from the Hebrew scriptures. A codex is just a technical word for what we call a book. There is some dispute and some argument, a very good-natured argument, about whether it was Christianity that actually brought the book form into popular use. It may well have done, because obviously if you're St. Paul and you're traveling across the Middle East, it's a darn sight easier to carry a book than it is a load of scrolls. So it's possible that the book form actually originated with Christianity. This tiny fragment was found in a rubbish dump in Egypt called, if I pronounce it correctly, Oxyrhynchus. Part of a codex of Mark's Gospel. On the front, it's part of Mark chapter 1, verses 7 to 9. On the back, Mark chapter 1, 16 to 18. And it's now in the Sackler Library in Oxford, but there's a nice backstory to it. There is in the States an organization that set up something called the Museum of the Bible. And they were approached, said, would you like to buy the oldest bit of Mark's Gospel known to humankind? Oh, yes, please. So they got into negotiations only to discover that the person offering it them had no means of getting it for them, and it looked like a bit of a scam. It's only in the Sackler Library by courtesy of the Egyptian government. It's there legally, but anyway, it didn't go to the States. And it wasn't first century, which is what the great excitement was about initially. It's actually second century. The New Testament canon, that is the collection of books that people agree is the what we now have as a New Testament, you may be able to see that somewhere between 45 and 90, the New Testament texts largely came into existence. You've got to get up towards the AD 200 when you get Irenaeus, who quotes all but 4 of the New Testament books. Above the line, you see the Gnostic Gospels were written. And it wasn't really until the late 4th century, 397, before there was a rough and only rough agreement about which book should be in the New Testament. In fact, that rough agreement still does not exist across the churches of the world. So, for instance, first of all, the great debate was, should the book of Revelation be in the New Testament canon at all? Some churches said yes, some said no. The church in Armenia took until the 12th century before they decided to allow it into their version of the New Testament. And the Coptic Church, this is my throwaway line really, the Coptic Church headquarters in Britain are in the diocese of which I was once bishop in Stevenage. They still have in Coptic Bibles 2 documents called the Epistles of Clement, which aren't in the Gospels that you might see in the bookshop down the road or in your churches. And in the West, of course, there's a difference between Catholic Bibles and Protestant Bibles. Now, if you want to find the oldest surviving complete New and Old Testament, you need to go to the British Library. And there you'll see a codex dating from the mid-4th century, handwritten on very thin vellum. And as you can see, each page has 4 columns. On many of those pages, there are corrections by later copyists and editors. This collection includes a book called The Shepherd of Hermas, which we don't have now in our Western New Testaments, not part of the canon as we know it. Just over 400 leaves of this Bible are scattered around the world. University of Leipzig, some in St. Petersburg, some still in St. Catherine, Sinai, where this was first discovered. Another ancient codex, the Codex Vaticanus. This dates from the 4th century. That's when it was named and housed in the Vatican. 700 pages of vellum, but bits of the original are missing. Oh, that's done me a real favor. Hamish, I can't read my script now.
So this is the very last time I'm coming to Haslemere.
That's fine, Hamish. That's absolutely fine. Sorry. Is that okay? Is the screen visible or is it a bit difficult? Okay. Lovely. Thank you very much. That's the Codex Vaticanus. And then, of course, we come to St. Jerome, who in the late 4th, early 5th century was invited by Pope Damasus I to translate the Bible into Latin. And he moved to Jerusalem and Bethlehem to better acquaint himself with the original Hebrew. He was fluent in Greek, but went back to some of the original Hebrew sources. Why is he shown with a lion? Because legend has it that he removed a thorn from a lion's paw. Now, it was his version of the Bible that was called the Vulgate, which just means commonly used. And that became the dominant version of the Bible used in Western Europe from the 4th, 5th century on. Nice bit of Victorian hagiography of the Venerable Bede. I say it's Victorian because it was a Victorian artist who created this. The Venerable Bede, a wonderful historian, this is supposedly about when he was on his deathbed, he was translating the Gospel of John into Anglo-Saxon. We don't have it anymore, we just know that that's partly what he did. And I put Alfred the Great in here because he didn't translate the Bible as such, but he's reputed to have translated the 10 Commandments from Latin into Anglo-Saxon, and he's reputed to have translated 50 of the Psalms from Latin into Anglo-Saxon. And that lovely little jewel is now in Oxford. When he made his translations, especially of the letters of Pope Gregory the Great, which he gave to all his bishops, he sent with them a pointer, a jeweled pointer. And on that jeweled pointer, of which that is an example there, it says Alfred had this made, the pointer, in other words. It's a lovely, lovely touch, now in the Ashmolean. We're now coming to the 7th, 8th century with the Lindisfarne Gospels, originally written in Latin, but glossed into Anglo-Saxon in the 10th century. And these are the oldest extant translations of the Gospels into English. And here comes a Surrey connection, in fact, a Farnham connection in particular, because the Winchester Bible was commissioned by Henry of Blois, who was Bishop of Winchester between 1150 and 1175, grandson of William the Conqueror, the builder of Farnham Castle. The script was probably the work of one man, and the illuminations a work of 6 artists, including one with a lovely name, Master of the Leaping Figures. It's of course in Latin, and it's Jerome's translation, the Vulgate. I was looking at details about St. Bartholomew's on the web before I came to see if I could link in any of this talk with St. Bartholomew's and Haslemere. Bit of a struggle. All I can say is that the reputed 13th century tower of St. Bartholomew's was built, where are we, 100 years after the Winchester Bible. I don't know if that means anything to you or not, but you know, it seemed a useful little local detail. But the Bible that would have been used in St. Bartholomew's all the way through would have been the Vulgate, the Latin translation by St. Jerome. I am genuinely going to come to the King James Bible, but it's put it in context. So we now come to the 14th century, a Bible created in England. It's associated with John Wycliffe, but probably written by some of his followers. And they translated the Latin Bible into Middle English. And you can just see down that bottom paragraph, in the beginning was the word. See a big capital I, but it's in Middle English. Very, very beautiful. That Bible was associated with the Lollard movement. And I don't know enough about the history of Haslemere to know whether there were any people around in the woods and in the Weald who were Lollards. There were certainly some over in Farnham. and especially over into Hampshire and up into the Chilterns. These were free-thinking, independent people who wanted the Bible available in English to themselves. Tyndale's Bible, 16th century. Well, first English Bible to be translated from the Hebrew and Greek, not written entirely by William Tyndale. He was executed in 1536 under the orders of Thomas More. Before he was executed, he'd translated the New Testament or about half the Old, and the rest of the Old Testament was translated by Miles Coverdale. So the Tyndale Coverdale Bible was the first in England to be produced with the new technology of printing. Question: why was Tyndale murdered? Answer: because according to his Catholic accusers, he translated some of the words of the Vulgate, such as priest, with the word elder. Instead of the word church, he translated that as congregation. Instead of the words do penance, he translated those words as repent. So in other words, he was, by his translation, undermining some of the traditional Catholic teaching, and that wasn't acceptable. We're now getting closer. We come to the Matthew Bible, and I like to put this in. It was published in 1537 by a man called John Rogers. So why is it called the Matthew Bible? Answer: to bewilder and confuse King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII couldn't stand Tyndale, couldn't stand the work he was doing in translating the Bible into English, but eventually was persuaded that perhaps he should think a bit more about it. So those responsible decided to invent a translator, whom they called Thomas Matthew. So it was people after William Tyndale who put this Bible together. John Rogers himself survived Henry VIII, but didn't survive Queen Mary because he was burnt alive by her for having produced this Bible. Meanwhile, if you're up to speed with Wolf Hall and all of that, The Mirror and the Light, the most recent book, wonderful, wonderful stuff by Hilary Mantel. You'll know there was a reforming party inside Henry's court, people who wanted to take some of the teachings of Lutheranism, some of the teachings of people like Zwingli over in Switzerland, and infiltrate them into the church in England. Anne Boleyn was probably, more than likely, part of the reforming party. So they eventually persuaded King Henry VIII that there should be in every church an English Bible. It was called the Great Bible. And it was essentially the work of Tyndale and Miles Coverdale, with some of Tyndale's translations toned down a bit so as not to anger Henry VIII. I'm sorry, I've only got another Farnham story here, but I love it. Okay, so that's 1539. In his will of 1539, a Farnham shoemaker called Thomas Champion left 8 shillings in his will for a Bible to be purchased by St Andrewes Church in the centre of Farnham. And I love that little story because it was a craftsman, an artisan, who actually brought about a massive revolution in English thought and English thinking by paying for the Bible to be placed, the Bible in English to be placed in St Andrews. Up to that point, as in St Bartholomew's here, it would have been a Latin Bible. But now every church in the country, St Andrews, Farnham, St Bartholomew's, Haslemere, had to have in law an English Bible. because of Queen Mary's decision and belief that she needed to reinvigorate Catholicism in this country, a number of Protestants fled to Geneva, including Miles Coverdale. And they produced the first Bible, we think it's the first Bible, with verse numbering. Up to that point, there'd been no verse numbers. But by the side of that Bible, there were quite a few interpolations, not of the text, but of interpretations of the text. And it was very favored by the church in Scotland because it had a kind of Calvinist tone, Calvinist after John Calvin. And it was the first Bible to be produced in Scotland ever in English in 1579. And it was taken on the Mayflower to America, so it had quite an influence there. Anglicans, High Church Anglicans, disagreed with much of what was in the Geneva Bible, and they led and persuaded King James to produce another one. So the bishops were asked to produce a Bible designed to be read in churches, sometimes called the Treacle Bible because it translated the phrase balm in Gilead as treacle in Gilead for some reason. Is there not treacle at Gilead? And it was the bishop's Bible which provided the basis for what we now come to. So here we are, King James. So a suitably evocative portrait by a Dutch painter born in Delft called Daniel Meitens. As you know, James's journey from Scotland to England was a gloriously stage-managed affair, and the whole thing had been set up by Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury. He was an extremely able courtier, civil servant, and, as it were, politician. He was now the he was the spider at the center of the Jacobean web. He was a very tiny spider. He was only 5 feet 4 inches tall. And James referred to him, I quote, as my elf, my beagle, my pygmy. Poor Cecil suffered from scoliosis of the spine and was hunchbacked. And in an age when physical appearance was believed to reveal the innermost soul of a person, if you were deformed in that kind of way, it meant you were not treated very well by the general public. So he had to survive. This man could only survive by his intelligence and by his wit and by his ability. This is awfully relevant for us now. The plague hit London in 1603. So James was there and the plague was there. And by the end of 1603, over 30,000 people had died out of an estimated population of 140,000. So roughly a fifth of the population of London had died. It's as though in our current pandemic, 2 or 3 million people in London alone had died. During the plague, Puritan preachers began to claim that the plague was a visitation from God upon a wicked and lawless populace. It was God punishing people for their misbehavior. But it wasn't only the Puritans who preached like that. So did Lancelot Andrewes, who declared that the plague was the handiwork of God. It's as though during our current pandemic, Justin Welby had stood up and said, it's quite clear this pandemic is divine wrath being visited on all the people of the world. And he hasn't said it, but you can see that if you interpret the world in the way in which Lancelot Andrewes, as a High Church Anglican, and the Puritans did, you would see why they said that. You may not agree with it now at all, but you can see why it was said. And because the Bible was so central to cultural and religious and social life, the lens through which you looked at the world was Bible-centered. Everything was interpreted in the light of what the Bible said. Now, during the journey that James made from Scotland to England, the Puritans petitioned him. They petitioned him to change things, that the cross in baptism, interrogatories administered to infants, confirmation are superfluous and may be taken away. Baptism not to be ministered by women, that is, by midwives. The cap and surplice not urged, that examination may go before the communion, that it be administered with a sermon, etc., etc. The ring in marriage be done away with. The longsomeness of service abridged. I bet people are upset and ready to that. Church songs and music moderated to better edification, that the Lord's day be not profaned. The rest upon holy days not so strictly urged, that there be a uniformity of doctrine prescribed, no Roman Catholic opinion to be any more taught or defended, etc., etc., etc. That was a petition presented to James I. What they didn't realize was that one of James I's kind of ruling metaphors as a politician was from Tacitus. Those who don't know how to dissimulate know not how to rule. I don't know who that applies to now in the political classes, but I leave that to your imagination. However, the Puritans thought they'd won James over to their way of thinking, to their theological position. He expressed some sympathy, decided he'd hold a conference at Hampton Court in January 1604 to hear the Puritan side of the argument and the more high church Anglican side of the argument. And he was also hovering around the home counties trying to avoid the plague. At that conference, which began in January 1604, King James himself chaired it, and he said he was delighted to be among grave, learned, and reverend men. And then the debates began. Amongst the people present was the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, Lancelot Andrewes, John Reynolds, the Bishop of Winchester, who preached at the coronation, 5 deans, representatives of moderate Puritanism, including that man on the right, a man called John Reynolds, who was a very open-minded Puritan representative. The Archbishop, Whitgift, and Lancelot Andrewes were opposed to many of the views of the Puritans, but the Puritans were represented by people like John Reynolds, who was president of the Corpus in Oxford. What the Puritans wanted was a different form of church order. They wanted what became the church order in Scotland, Presbyterianism. Well, in Presbyterianism, those of you who are from a Scottish background will know each church is governed, each individual church is governed by a body of church elders. They're responsible to a local group often called classis, and they in turn collect nationally into an assembly. In other words, the Puritans didn't want anything to do with bishops. But James had had enough. Do I need to stop, Gary? You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. But James had had enough of Scottish Presbyterianism and said if he wanted that, he would have gone back to Scotland. And it was there that he made his famous remark, "No bishop, no king." So the Bishop's Bible was the basis for the translation. However, the Puritan side of English life wanted the Geneva Bible. James heartily disliked the Geneva Bible, so he ordered that a compromise should be reached and there should be a brand new translation. So ironically, it was probably John Reynolds who gave him the idea that there should just be one Bible in the churches, one uniform translation to be done by the learned of both universities, reviewed by the bishops and the chief learned men of the church, finally to be ratified by the king himself, and then to be read in the whole church and no other. And that was a political masterstroke. He was trying to hold together two warring parties. And he hoped that by creating this Bible, which was then had to be read in churches, he would, as it were, unify the kingdom if he could. The man who oversaw this extraordinary process was Archbishop Richard Bancroft. He and King James worked closely together, but he himself was vehemently anti-Puritan, and he was a convinced monarchist. Now, when you're setting up any committee, if you want to get your own way, you know that you invite onto it those people who are likely to be in favor of you. So James and Bancroft, they didn't, how can I put it? They pulled together a committee, certainly in which Puritans were represented, but it was more weighted towards the kind of what we might call Anglican church tradition. But how were these people to be paid? Bancroft said he would pay the translators by taking money from vacant livings, but there are no records, so we don't know how much he collected, if anything. We don't know how the people were paid, but the process was extraordinary. There were to be 6 subcommittees called companies. Each of those companies had a director. There were 9 members in each company. Each piece of text had to be translated by an individual. He then had to bring it back to be scrutinized and agreed by members of his company. It was eventually taken to a full translators committee, then to the Privy Council, and then to King James. And there were sets of rules for the translators. So, the ordinary Bible read in church, commonly called the Bishop's Bible, to be followed, and as little altered as the truth of the original will permit. That was the rule. In fact, only 8% of the phrases of the Bishop's Bible ended up in the King James Version, but it was an important principle established. In other words, the Geneva Bible, the Bible of the Puritans, was not to be given any house room. The names of the prophets and the holy writers, with the other names in the text, to be retained as near as may be, according as they are vulgarly used. Now, why did they want that in? You think it's obvious. Well, because the Puritans and the Geneva Bible had put explanations down in the margins. So, for instance, the name Timothy was translated as fear God, and this particular set of rules said we don't want anything like that. No messing about with what's actually in the text. The old ecclesiastical words to be kept. The word church not to be translated as congregation. You can see the politics going on here. So in other words, the Puritan Presbyterian idea of the church as the local congregation was not to be allowed inside this Bible. No marginal notes at all to be affixed, but only for the explanation of the Hebrew or Greek words, which cannot without some circumlocution so briefly and fitly be expressed in the text. Why did they want that in, that rule? Because in the Geneva Bible, all the margins were filled with commentary by various divines trying to interpret what was going on. They said, no, 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 just the text and the text alone. And as Adam Nicholson says, this is the heart of the new Bible as an irenicum, an organism that absorbed an integrated difference, that included ambiguity, and by doing so established peace. It's the central mechanism of the translation, one of immense lexical subtlety, a deliberate carrying of multiple meanings beneath the surface of a single text. Adam Nicholson's book on the King James Bible is just simply superb. And if you can get a copy, do treat yourself. It's absolutely wonderful. Each particular man of each company to take the same chapter or chapters, and having translated or amended them severally by himself, where he thinks good, all to meet together, confirm what they've done, and agree for their part what shall stand. In other words, the King James Version was a version created by committees. Hard to believe, but that's exactly what it was. Who were the people involved? Well, people like John Overall. There were 6 companies: Westminster 1 and 2, Cambridge 1 and 2, Oxford 1 and 2. There's a bit of scurrilous doggerel here. I quote the fact the Dean of St Paul's, John Overall's beautiful young wife, left him for another man in the middle of his translation work. So this is the doggerel. The Dean of St Paul's did search for his wife, and where do you think he found her? Even upon Sir John Selby's bed, as flat as any flounder. Yeah. There was a layman, a non-English person involved as a translator, Hadrian Saravia, been born in Artois to Spanish Netherlandish parents, and he was a professor of theology at Leiden. There was a layman, Sir Henry Saville, who was eventually warden of Merton and provost of Eton. He tutored Elizabeth I in Greek. There was Lawrence Chatterton, one of the representative Puritans. Now, here's a nice irony. It was Chatterton who translated the Song of Songs. It's beautiful. My beloved spake and said unto me, rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. For lo, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, the time of the singing of birds is come, and the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. Oh, it's just beautiful, beautiful. And you wouldn't have assumed that that would have been translated so beautifully by somebody who was from the Puritan wing of the church, but it was. Anybody from Surrey involved? Answer, yes, George Abbot from Guildford. He was one of the translators. Is a statue at the top of Guildford High Street, quite close to the hospital that he founded. Now, I suppose he's more famous in kind of horrible histories for having accidentally killed a gamekeeper when he was out hunting. So, always going according to plan, always doing well. And then there was what we would call a terrorist incident, the gunpowder plot. It was foiled, as we know, and arguments have raged ever since about how much the authorities knew in advance. What was the role of Robert Cecil in that? Did he know? Did he let it go on and on and on so that right at the end he could foil the gang? Much hatred of Jesuits at the time, because it was thought they were trying to overturn the monarchy. And there were halls in places like Worcestershire, Harvington Hall, and in Warwickshire, where priests hold themselves up whilst they were being sought for. And Father Garnet, who was the head of the Jesuits in England, was eventually executed. Who tried to persuade him to recant? Answer, George Abbot, one of the translators, and one of the other translators, John Overall. Come to Hatfield House. Why have I put this in? I'm indebted to Adam Nicholson for this notion, because I think it's gorgeous. The translators were disrupted by the gunpowder plot, but it eventually picked up again. What is interesting is that Adam Nicholson says there is a kind of relationship between the architecture and the interior of Hatfield to the King James Bible. He talks about the elegance and the robustness of the house. This was where Robert Cecil lived. He'd done a deal with the king. Before that, Robert Cecil had lived in Theobald's, no longer in existence, and the king wanted that, so he did a swap and gave Cecil Hatfield to own and develop. And this house was begun and built and designed at exactly the same period of time as the King James Bible, the Authorised version, was going on. So look at the windows. Light was absolutely everything. As Nicholson writes, light was understanding. And he quotes Matthew Smith, the author of the preface. Translation it is that openeth the window to let in the light, that breaketh the shell, that we may eat the kernel, that putteth aside the curtain, that we may look into the most holy place, that removeth the cover of the well, that we may come by the water. Oh, brilliant. So, quick visit to Hatfield. This is the entrance hall, and you can see how robust and strong it is. It's pure Jacobean architecture. It appeals to antiquity, but it's solid. Here is the amazing staircase. So it's full of craftsmanship and purity and complexity. It's Baroque architecture was always about contrasts, always, and plenty here. Richness for eye and ear. This is the drawing room in Hatfield. Absolutely lovely. And you won't need reminding that the King James Version was written at the time when English was at its peak in some ways, as the means by which theatre expressed itself. This was, of course, the Globe, close by the Bishop of Winchester's London residence. This is Adam Nicholson again. This was the gift of the language moment, the great Jacobean habit of mind on which the King James Bible rides for chapter after chapter and book after book, is this swinging between majesty and tangibility, the setting of the actual and perceptible within an enormous and enriching frame, the sense of intimacy between great and small, the embodiment of the most universal ideas in the most humble of forms, the sense, in other words, that the universe is one connected fabric. Well, the Puritan end of the Christian spectrum at that time split off into various groups. I've referred to them as Puritans so far, but they were all still members of the Church of England. But the separatists, or Presbyterians, as some people then called them, they believed in the priesthood of all believers. So they met in barns and such places for their meetings, which were dominated by prayer and exposition of the Bible. There was a group at Scrooby in Nottinghamshire. They made their way to Boston on the Lincolnshire coast, intending to board ship for the Netherlands. Anyway, they had a terrible time trying to do that. Eventually, they all got to the Netherlands, and then they emigrated to the United States. And what they took with them was the King James Bible. And that's why the Authorised version, the King James Bible, became very, very significant in the States from then on, became, rather than the Geneva Bible, which Mayflower had taken, the King James Version became the foundational document of the Pilgrim Fathers. Meanwhile, in the C of E, there were new liturgical developments, such as this church, St Mary Croscombe in Somerset, where rood screens were reintroduced to make the Eucharist, the Mass, the Holy Communion more holy, separate in a new place. A sense of holiness and distance were created. Words alone, in other words, were not enough. Although the Bible was central, there was a recognition that in worship, all our senses are involved. And in sermons, you'll recognize this, but fantastic sermon. A cold coming they had of it at this time of the year, just the worst time of the year to take a journey, and especially a long journey. The way's deep, the weather sharp, the day short, the sun farthest off, in solstitio brumale, the very dead of winter. That was the Nativity sermon in 1622. And it was Lancelot Andrewes who was responsible for translating Genesis with his company. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And it's just fantastic, majestic, beautiful, beautiful language, which somehow by its sheer beauty and its sonority takes us into meaning. At least that's my view. So there's Lancelot Andrewes. Some dates. In 1608, all the companies had to produce their texts, and they were collated together. There was then a plenary session, and in that plenary, it wasn't just a session, it went on, as you can see, for 2 years, where the divines sat around with all the texts produced by the companies until they could agree an absolute and final text, which they shaped into a coherent whole. The secretary of this, what a task he had, was a man called John Boyes, who was a Cambridge scholar. Now, when they tried to bring these texts together, they didn't just look at them, they read them aloud to each other. So it had to be not only accurate in terms of translating the original Greek and Hebrew, but it had to sound right. So because for the most part, this was a Bible that was going to be read aloud. It would be partly the sound that conveyed the meaning. So it wasn't the language of the street, it was actually the language of the theatre. But by spring 1611, a final text was agreed. So 2 years of reading the Bible from Genesis 1 right through to the end of Revelation, being read aloud one to another. Then came the design work. A man called Cornelius Boyle, who was a Fleming, was commissioned to create the title page. Did it, of course, as you can see, in a totally Baroque style. All attention on the Bible itself. But there is an announcement at the very bottom of that page, appointed to be read in churches. So in that sense, it was a public book to be read aloud in churches. And the preface, beautiful, written by the Bishop of Winchester. Great and manifold were the blessings, most dread sovereign, which Almighty God, the Father of all mercies, bestowed upon us, the people of England, when first he sent your Majesty's royal person to rule and reign over us. For whereas it was the expectation of many who wish not well unto our Zion, that upon the setting of that bright occidental star, Queen Elizabeth, of most happy memory, some thick and palpable clouds of darkness would so have overshadowed this land that men should have been in doubt which way they were to walk. And it should hardly be known who was to direct the unsettled state. The appearance of your Majesty as of the sun in his strength instantly dispelled those supposed and surmised mists, etc. Golly. I mean, it's not our taste, of course. It feels a bit sort of creeping. But you can see that, again, the sonority, the sound, the language itself, which rolls around. And Miles Smith, the Bishop of Gloucester, that's Thomas Bilson. Here's Miles Smith, the Bishop of Gloucester, one of the translators of part of the Old Testament. And he wrote an explanation of what the translators have been trying to do. Zeal to promote the common good, whether it be by devising anything ourselves or revising that which hath been laboured by others, deserveth certainly much respect and esteem, but yet findeth but cold entertainment in the world. It is welcomed with suspicion instead of love, and with emulation instead of thanks. And if there be any hole left for cavil to enter, and cavil, if it do not find a hole, will make one, it is sure to be misconstrued and in danger to be condemned. This will easily be granted by as many as know story or have any experience. For was there ever anything projected that savoured any way of newness or renewing, but the same endured many a storm of gainsaying or opposition? There were some printers' errors. Those of you who've written books or attempted to publish them will know this can happen even to the very best. There's one called the blasphemous comma. Luke chapter 23, verse 32 read, and there were also two other malefactors crucified with Jesus. In other words, it should have read, and there were also two others, comma, malefactors. Otherwise, it made Jesus look like a malefactor. Or the Judas Bible. So this Bible has Judas saying, sit ye here while I go yonder and pray. And the second folio edition of that is held in Totnes. Then there was the printer's Bible. This is a wonderful Freudian slip. In some copies, Psalm 119, verse 161 reads, printers have persecuted me without a cause, rather than princes have persecuted me without a cause. Adam Nicholson. It's impossible now to experience in an English church the enveloping amalgam of tradition, intelligence, beauty, clarity of purpose, intensity of conviction, and plangent, heart-gripping godliness, which is the experience of page after page of the King James Bible. Nothing in our culture can match its breadth, depth, and universality, unless, curiously enough, it is something that was written at exactly the same time and in almost exactly the same place, the great tragedies of Shakespeare. Well, I grew up with the King James Version, as no doubt many of you did, hardly ever used now, hardly ever. And in my view, that's a massive loss, both to our religious understanding and to the culture of our country. An absolutely ginormous loss. But it was read aloud, and those of us who grew up with it will know how much we owe to it. I wish it were used more often. And now we have banal translations. In the beginning, when God created the universe, the earth was formless and desolate. The raging ocean that covered everything was engulfed in total darkness, and the Spirit of God was moving over the water. Then God commanded, let there be light, and light appeared. God was pleased with what he saw. I mean, isn't that dire? Dire. It's amazing God didn't just say, oh, that's cool. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. I mean, this is language that carries us by its rhythms and by its shape and by its beauty. And I grew up with, as no doubt you did, things like, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal, 1 Corinthians 13. I mean, is there any better? I know charity means love and all of that. But when you stand to read something aloud, you need the rhythm to provide breaks in the right places. And this does it naturally, even though this was the result of a committee at work. I want to end with a quotation from Adam Nicholson. The flattening of language is the flattening of meaning. Oh, that's so absolutely true. And I'm afraid in the church of which I am still obviously a member, that flattening of language is now everywhere, absolutely everywhere. So that as a result, the depth of meaning that you get when language is rich and rhythmical and sonorous and looks backwards as well as forwards, all that is gone. You know, we might as well read a Kellogg's cornflakes packet for all the difference it makes. Well, the King James Version helped shape me, and I'm enormously grateful for it and for the translators. It still resides in my soul. And I used to say when I was a vicar and had curates, if by any chance any of you are at my deathbed and want to read something to me, please, please use the King James Version, because it's that has lodged deep in my soul. Perhaps a Good News Bible will lodge deep in young people's souls, who knows? But for me, and I suspect for many in our generation, the King James Bible is so rich. And as W.H. Auden said, you know, why spit on your luck? I shall stop there. Thank you.
I've got one to sort of start us off.
You're Scottish, are you?
Sorry. I was brought up as Presbyterian.
Yes, of course.
I find the translation of the epistles really quite difficult to read.
Yes.
And I wonder if it was a different team doing it, or was it just started off more difficult?
I think it starts off slightly more difficult. You're absolutely right. I mean, I've been a bit lopsided in my analysis, because there are times when you read some of the epistles of Paul, what, in King James Version, what? I don't get this at all, don't get it. So yes, they were not, it may have been the company, but when you think it had to go through from an individual to the company to the big team, and then it was read aloud, presumably for them it worked. To be fair, as I say, I've been lopsided in this. You know, there have been contemporary translations which are much, much, much better and much clearer. I mean, if I'm pressed and asked what do I read the New Revised Standard Version on a daily basis. That's the one which gets closest in our contemporary culture to King James, but is actually much more understandable to the people. So I don't read the King James Version in my daily prayers. I use the New Revised Standard Version. That's as close as I can get. But you're right, absolutely right. Yeah.
I think it's a question.
Yeah, fire away, fire away.
During the first lockdown, I read Trevelyan in the number of stewards. And if you read Trevelyan, he's the classic Whig historian. The British had a war, they were kinder to each other than people on the continent. And if they tortured other people, they did it in a much kinder way than people abroad. Now, everything about that time was good. Thank you for your talk. But what struck me, I mean, I'm an Englishman, I'm age 64. I have known since I was raised a Catholic. I used to read the Diary Bible, but I've always known how beautiful the King James Bible is. What struck me as you spoke was my ignorance of translations across Europe. The French must have translated the Bible at this time, the Germans.
Yeah.
And some of the beauty of the language simply comes from its age. That was stuff that's not familiar to us now.
Yeah.
I wonder what you might know about those other translations and how they compare with what you
Gosh. The answer is not much.
Can you repeat? Yes,
But yes, I'll repeat the question. The question was about translations in other European countries from Latin into French, German, whatever. I wish there may be some German speakers here, but it is said that what Luther did was to translate from the Latin into a German, which then became the kind of common language of Germany, and that he managed to capture some of the sonority and beauty of the Latin in his German, partly because he was a poet as well. You know, his hymns have had enormous influence. England was miles behind the rest of the continent in translating the Bible into English. You know, there had been French versions for centuries before that. So I don't quite understand why some places, you know, got on with translating into the vernacular and England was miles behind. Partly in our case, it was Henry VIII holding everything back because he was by nature and by disposition a traditionalist, even though he kept breaking all the rules. But it was partly political in our own country. and partly a desire. Why the Bible was so significant was it was partly a desire to hold our potentially warring country together. You know, there'd been the Wars of the Roses and all of that. And later on, there'd be the Civil War. So it only held it together briefly. But I'm afraid I don't know enough about other European translations. The man who does is a man called John Barton, who wrote a book about the Bible about 2 years ago, 2 years, something like that. And you may find in that the answer to your own question. But so I'm in that sense, I apologize. I'm a little Englander, not by disposition or temperament at all, but it's because this is what I know best. And like all people who lecture, you have to admit, you know, as my son says to me, Dad, it's amazing how much you know about so little. Sorry, somebody else said to me the other day, they were talking about their daughter. Their daughter was giving them a hard time about something they'd written. And he said, she treats me with affectionate contempt. That's a beautiful phrase. Yeah, thank you.
There's another question there.
Yes, please, sir.
We all know there are different views on the creation of the earth.
Yes.
The universe. I think even recently a politician has been appointed, is it in America? Probably.
No, Northern Ireland.
Ah, yes, who thinks the world was created 4,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Thus ignoring all the scientific
Sure.
evidence. Do you agree that there's if you grasp that trying to unify the two threads, that the way Genesis describes the beginning can be construed as the description of the Big Bang? It's compatible with science. That phrase, let there be light.
Yeah.
Bang.
Yeah.
And yet what's replaced it now is horrible, as you said.
Thank you. The question was about compatibility, really, of religion and science, especially in relation to the book of Genesis. I am not a creationist. In other words, I do not believe that the earth was created about 6,000 years ago in October, as Bishop Usher tried to work out very carefully, not stupidly. He was genuinely trying to work it out. I don't follow that. I'm a man of my age, and no doubt if there are bishops in the future, they'll look back and say, what was he on about? So I shall have got lots of things wrong. What I do think is surprising is that the sequence of events in Genesis, as you suggested, actually marries pretty closely to how we currently scientifically understand things. On the other hand, I'm a great admirer of Carlo Rovelli, who's written a lot of popular books about quantum physics. I'm not a physicist. I failed physics miserably at O-level, and finding the only question I could possibly deal with on my exam paper was how to draw a thermos flask. Well, I could do that, so I liked art, couldn't do the rest. Nevertheless, when I read quantum physics and his explanation, I find it absolutely exhilarating, because this is a group of people who are pushing the boundaries of language and therefore understanding and trying to find appropriate metaphors in exactly the same kind of way as Lancelot Andrewes and co were pushing metaphors and trying to find the right language. I don't think there is a basic incompatibility at all between religion and science, except when religious people become closed-minded, and except when scientists become closed-minded, then you get incompatibility. But for me, the joy of my faith and the joy of science is that there is so much overlap and so much things to think about and different questions and ways of approaching things differently, that if only we just listen to each other, just listen to what each other is saying and saying, what can I learn from that physicist? What might he be willing and able to learn from me, having steeped my life in this biblical world, if you like, but in the Christian world. Now, the difficulty comes, I think, because Christianity inevitably has an overarching meta-narrative, a big narrative which swings across everything. which begins with God as creator, comes to Jesus, comes to the end time. So it's a huge, huge flowing narrative. For me, that makes sense of the world as I know it, but I'm very, very aware that for many people it no longer does. They just can't get it. And I'm not prepared to shout through a megaphone and say, you stupid people. I fully understand why that huge meta-narrative, which I was brought up with, does not meet people's intellectual needs where they are at the moment. But I find a struggle to interpret. Sorry, I'm going to sound a bit preachy. I don't mean to be. Ultimately, I have to come back to the figure and person of Jesus. That's what keeps grabbing me. I can't get away. I may not agree or may not believe in all the meta-narrative, but ultimately I find him such a fascinating, intriguing, difficult, awkward, different, holy, challenging character. I can never get away from who he is and what he meant. But I hope I don't do that in such a way that it stops my mind thinking about art or about maths or about physics. I think it should, for those of us who have this faith, it should say to us, come on, open your eyes, open your minds, open your hearts to what's going on in this fantastic world and see what you can understand. None of us could grasp it all. None of us, not even Einstein. I certainly don't.
I think that's a wonderful place for me to thank you so much. Stop. Let me just come in and talk to our Zoom audience. We had no questions from the Zoom audience, but I'd just like to thank Chris so much for both such an interesting journey through the progress of the Bible, but also for considerable humor as well, and such interesting delivery. Chris, thank you so much. You can switch off now. Thank you very much.